And you can click on that if you want to raise it and get our attention. It's just a little icon, and if you want to practice that right now, you're welcome to. And then if you want to lower your hand, you can click on it again. So if anybody would like to give that a try, if you're not seeing it, you're welcome to ask in the chat, or I see a couple of practices going up there. So you can use that to get our attention, or you can just type into the chat box. And then I did also want to let everybody know that we are recording this session primarily so that we can go back and listen to your comments and questions and feedback, but also as a resource for all of you if you'd like to go back and review the material or digest it a little more or share it with others in your neighborhoods. So again, if you have any technical problems, just let us know in the chat. Otherwise, let's try to keep ourselves muted unless we're speaking. And we'll actually take a moment just so this all feels a little more familiar. I know many of you know each other, but some of you do not or might not. We'll take a moment to do introductions. This is going to be the only time in this meeting where I call on people by name. So it will be up to you if you're comfortable speaking up, and we hope that everyone will. But as we move into discussion, I won't call anybody out. But the best way for us to go around the loop for introductions is for me to call on people. So I will do that now, and we can start with Anna, if you want to unmute and tell us who you are and your neighborhood or your affiliation, and then we'll go around the group.
Hey everyone, I'm Anna with Metro Planning. I've met with some of you over the past few years. I'm in the Long Range Planning Division, so deal a lot with land use policy and community meetings. So I'm here to help Sean navigate the chat and who's raising hands and if there are any issues and that type of thing. So please feel free to use the chat for not just technical issues, but if you have a thought that you don't want to share or have run out of time or just it pops into your head, please use the chat to let us know what you're thinking. And I'm happy to be here and excited to hear the discussion. And I will have Catherine, also with planning, introduce herself next.
Hi, thanks, Anna. Hi, guys. I'm Catherine Harman. I'm a planner with Metro Planning. I'm pretty new to Metro Planning. I've been with the department about 5 months or so. So I'm in the land development division. So I work with the review planners, and we look to review cluster lot subdivisions for compliance with the zoning regs. But just want to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, so I'm going to call on folks in the completely random order that WebEx shows you to me on my screen. So there's no logic or priority to this. While I'm doing it, I'm going to open up a polling question. So as long as you're joined into the meeting via a computer, you should be able to see this question, and while folks are introducing themselves, you can click your answer. But Tawana, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us your neighborhood or affiliation next?
Hey, Tawana Chick, Cane Ridge Community Club. I think I might be one of several who have been actually trying to encourage cluster lots for a while, but don't know the actual definition of them. It's just that logical thing that makes sense. We have a ridiculous amount of development trying to occur all at once out here. And so any additional tools you can help put in our toolbox will be great, because it definitely brings a lot of challenge to find balance that's right for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheryl, how about you next?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Cheryl Mays. I am with the Cambridge Forest community in Southeast Nashville, and a neighbor of Tawana Chick, my partner in crime there. So I have heard, in fact, about the cluster lot option, but again, I don't know as much as I would like to know about it, but I'm looking forward to learning more. So thanks for the invite.
Great, thank you for being here. Ruby, how about you next?
Hello. Hey, everyone. I'm Ruby Baker. I currently serve as the president of Bordeaux Hills Residential Association, and I also serve on the Metro Nashville Emergency Communications District Board and our 911 board. And my name is coming up DCV 1723 because I'm on a different laptop and I don't know how to go in and change the name. So that's me, Ruby Baker, Bordeaux Hills.
Thank you, Ruby, for being here. How about George next?
Thanks. Hi, folks. My name is George Ewing. I live in Whites Creek with Friends of Whites Creek, and I'm here because I'm excited to see about cluster lab applications similar to Tawana and Cane Ridge and achieving some, congruency, harmony, conservation benefits. And I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I see John Stern next.
Thank you. I like Cheryl, am working for Tawana at this point in my life and appreciate it. I first became aware of cluster lot developments back in the 90s when they were created. And to let you know, back then, organization like Ruby's and George's and Tawana's neighborhood associations, we fought back against them because we felt they weren't adequately protecting the neighborhoods around them. We understand the idea of saving desirable environmental features, but we felt that the planning department gave away the store when they set this up. So happy to see that we're back at the table talking about it.
All right, thank you. How about Gordon?
Hello, everyone. My name is Gordon Stacey Harman. I am the current chairperson for the Highland Heights Neighborhood Association, which is right off of Trinity and Dickerson over here in the extreme northeast of East Nashville. Also serve as the lead facilitator in the Neighbor to Neighbor Planning Academy, and have been in the past part of the planning think tank and such. And while cluster lot doesn't necessarily apply in our small neighborhood, it is something that I'm here to learn more about so that I can appropriately discuss the topic during the different planning academy sessions that we have coming up. So thank you for allowing me to be part of it.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And I see Jessica Schultz next.
Hello, I am Jessica Schultz. I'm actually just a citizen of the community. I live in the unofficial part of Villages of Larchwood, which is over in the Donaldson area. It is off of Elm Hill Pike and Bell Road area, right near the lake. But I was graciously invited to participate in this. Oh my goodness, on my turn. Sorry. Graciously invited to participate in this in regards to just being a voice for the community. We have a development that's being proposed currently and actually was on the agenda last week, I believe, and got postponed one meeting and then completely canceled because of the very bad storm that came through. So it abided me additional time to do research in regards to what this cluster lot is. What we have in our area as far as that is just the developers who that they know the planning rules, and us community members aren't really sure what is accurate, what we have the right to do, what they have the right to do, what part of our voice would actually be heard, and etc. So I'm looking forward to learning a little bit about this more specifically for the very current thing that's going on right behind my house.
Great. Well, I think a big part of what we're going to try to talk through today is just some education on what this is and what it does. So thank you for being here. All right, let me see. Next, I see Valerie. Would you like to say hello next?
Good morning, everybody. It's so good to see all of my beautiful neighborhood folks out there. Thanks so much for being here. And we're working with Sean and Anna to convene this group. And so we're very happy. I'm with Neighbor to Neighbor and happy to be here.
Thank you. How about Robbie Lynn? Would you like to say hello next?
Sure. Hey, I'm Robbie Lynn Hunsinger. I was the leader with the Save Ivy Drive group. I guess I still am the leader with the Save Ivy Drive group, which was specifically about trying to stop a cluster lot subdivision at the end of Ivy Drive, just off the Cumberland Bluff in Englewood. I've learned a great deal about municipal code, subdivision code. I'm happy to talk to any of y'all if I can be of service. We are still in the process. We just had our appeal hearing yesterday. So I'm happy to be here with y'all this morning. Thanks.
Thank you. Sherry, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm Sherry Weiner, and I am tickled to see so many of my buddies out there stepping up and getting involved again. I am happy to be invited to participate. I guess I'm representing Bellevue for a change, and possibly because I've had a little to do with planning over the past 8 or 9 years.
Thank you so much for being here. Winnie, how about, would you like to go next?
Yeah, Winnie Forrester. I live in the Haynes Heights neighborhood, which is off of Whites Creek Pike and West Trinity Lane. And we actually just recently had a big success because we were able to get one of the historic overlays, the neighborhood conservation overlay for our small neighborhood, which was, a big success for us. I'm also on the board of the Haynes Trinity Neighborhood Coalition, and I don't know a whole lot about cluster lots, but I'd love to learn more. So that's why I'm here. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. How about Lydia?
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Lydia Youssef. I'm the director of Id Mahabba Center. We serve Arabic-speaking immigrants and refugees and their children in particularly South Nashville. So I'm particularly interested in this as Antioch gets denser and denser, and in thinking of options for communities, and also hoping to kind of translate that and engage with our community members in South Nashville a little bit more to feel like they're part of this democratic process, and democratic in quotations, and feel like they have a say in what's happening in their city as well. So that's why I'm here.
Great, thank you so much for joining us. And then Teresa?
Yes, my name is Teresa, and I live in the Belle Arbor subdivision, which is in the Northeast Nashville area. So our subdivision is fairly new, and I'm just trying to learn as much as I can in order to be able to help our community in this area.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I believe that's everybody. Anna, did you see anyone that I missed or that has joined?
I don't believe so. I think that's everyone.
Okay. And so a lot of you were also able to take the poll. So I'll close that now. And in just a few seconds, it will let me share the results with you so that you can see. Of course, now that I've clicked on it, it's going to run its timer. But I think we have a good mix of experience with us today. So a couple of folks who are not familiar with cluster lots, some folks who have heard of it but are looking for more information, and then a few folks who have had experience with this kind of development in their neighborhood and have commented on it or learned about it that way. So that's great. So I'm going to walk you through next sort of the purpose of this exercise and the process that we're going to go through today. And basically, we have a few different goals with these conversations. So the Planning Commission has asked planning staff to look at the cluster lot option, which is a zoning tool, and we'll talk about that more in a minute, and then to work with various stakeholders to identify if there are any issues with the tool and discuss ways we could consider improving it. So one of the first things that we were kind of realizing is that we have a whole variety of different levels of understanding of this tool and what it could accomplish. And so our first goal today is to do some education. Sometimes it's hard to feel like you're ready to give feedback or suggestions if you don't really know a lot about the subject. So we want to get everyone kind of to a level of comfort so you feel, able to give us your thoughts and ideas. Secondly, the commission would like us to identify issues. So is the tool working well? Are there gaps or issues with any of the standards? Are the kinds of developments that are coming forward under this tool what we would expect? And we have some ideas or some things to share with you that we've heard based on public comment, but we very much want to get your thoughts and feedback on that as well. And then finally, our goal would be to talk about some solutions. Maybe there are some changes to the standards that might be appropriate and the commission could consider, and to build some consensus around those. I don't know that we'll get through all of this today. It's a lot of information to cover, but that's kind of our goal for the overall structure. I also want to make clear up front that staff has no preconceived direction for this, so we haven't drafted anything. We don't have amendments to show you yet. We're sort of starting with these conversations with different groups of stakeholders to get your perspective before we begin that part of the process. So here's what the process looks like. We're in what we're calling the evaluation phase. So we've looked at some of the past cluster lot approvals, but we're also primarily interested in talking to different groups of stakeholders in this kind of smaller setting and your take. And then after these meetings, we'll move into, depending on what we hear, we'll move into kind of a drafting phase where we'll take your ideas. We might research those or develop some possible changes to the code. We'll test all that out. Does it work on certain sites or not? Is it legally possible? And then we'll likely come back to these small groups, maybe with you mixed together with the other kind of categories of stakeholders, and ask you to help us refine it. And then at that point, if there are changes that should be put forward for the commission, we'll move into an adoption process. And that'll include the usual broad public comment periods that many of you may have experience with, where anybody can read the proposal and give us their thoughts. And we'll hope that if we get to that point and we move into that you guys will also be able to help us by being a resource for your neighbors and helping them understand what's proposed and be able to tell the Planning Commission what they think. And then because these are zoning standards, ultimately, before anything could change, the Metro Council will have to hold public hearings on this, and they'll make the final decision if there are changes put forward. So who are we talking to? We started with these kind of smaller, what we're calling stakeholder groups. So we're meeting with you guys today. We've sort of dubbed you the neighborhood leaders. You can choose a different team name if you want, but that's how we're categorizing you in our mind, folks who are sort of representative of their communities and able to help disseminate the information. We've also spoken with some representatives of the development community who use this tool, and then with a group of folks who work for or volunteer with different kinds of advocacy organizations, largely focused on sort of conservation or environmental issues, because this is the tool that could help to achieve some of our open space or environmental protection goals if calibrated, right? And so we wanted to make sure that we had their expertise and perspectives at the table. And so we started with these groups separately because we did want people to have a comfortable environment where, everyone had a similar level of background experience. But then as we move forward, we're likely to put folks together so they can hear from each other. And then if we get into the adoption process, obviously we hope you'll stay engaged, but we'll have the larger general public, the Planning Commission and Council at the table as well. So how today's session will work. We're gonna kind of have in each section of our agenda some information from staff. This first section where we just give some background is potentially going to be a big chunk of our time. We want to give you enough information to spark discussion. We'll try not to bore you. And then we'll ask perhaps for each section one of those polling questions like you practiced with at the beginning, just to get your ideas flowing. And we'll have some time for discussion and questions based on your feedback. And then before we move forward to the next part of our agenda, we'll check in. We'll make sure that everybody's clear, that you've got your thoughts out on the table that you want to share with us, or if we need to circle back to anything. So if you have questions as we go, you're welcome to raise the hand icon, or if you have thoughts or questions, you can put them in the chat box, and we'll keep an eye on that. Anna will help interrupt me if I need to slow down and explain something. And we'll just kind of all work together to have a respectful discussion as best we can in this virtual environment. I know it feels a lot harder to figure out how and when to kind of jump in if you have a question or a thought. But hopefully folks will feel comfortable speaking up. And so with that, we'll do kind of our first check-in. Does anyone have any questions on the sort of process or how we're going to try to approach the rest of our time today?
Sean, I have a couple of things that have popped up in the chat that might be useful to address for the whole group. One is when we are doing our check-ins, is it possible to take the slides down so that you can see each other? I know we haven't done that, but I'm not sure what you think about taking your screen down. Sean, can you hear me? Oh, I think she's having time. So one question is taking the slides down so when we discuss, we can see everyone. And the other one is a question about, are we strictly discussing changes to the cluster law option, or does it include possible subdivision regulation changes? And I think Sean might be dialing back in, so I think she can hear me, but maybe not respond. So, and another question about, can we chat to the whole group? Absolutely. You should see in the chat, it should have a to box with a drop-down menu, and that has all the individual names, but at the very top, it says everyone. So if you select that option, when you want to type your chat, you should be able to send that to everyone. And I hope that helps. Sean, are you back with us?
I am back. Sorry.
Okay.
Spoiled by our own technology.
Yeah, that's okay. Were you able to hear what I was saying?
I heard the end part about how to chat with everyone. Did we get the other questions answered, or do you need me to address something else?
Yeah, I'll just quickly. The first one was just a question about when we're doing these check-in chats, can you stop sharing your screen so that people can see each other's faces?
Yeah.
And the next one was, are we, for this discussion, are we only talking about changes to cluster law, or does it include possible changes to subregs?
So, sure. I think that's a good question. We are at this point looking at the cluster lot option, but as I'm going to get into in a minute, that does overlap with some other parts of our regulations in terms of how it's utilized. I think for today, it's important to know that we're not setting out to alter the subdivision regulations. I think in particular, we're not setting out to alter what some of you may know as the rural character subdivision regulations. Those were developed through an extensive community process and are kind of their own thing. But we will take all of your feedback and we will go through the exercise of trying to figure out how to best address your questions and concerns. And we will go through the exercise of trying to figure out what kinds of regulations or what parts of the regulations would be affected if we wanted to accomplish what you suggest. So you don't have to worry about telling us where things fit. You just tell us what you think and we'll kind of back into how it fits into the regulations. And I think if all of that was like, I don't know what any of that means, don't worry about it. I'm going to walk you through kind of how the regulations work in the next section. But hopefully that will help folks know what we're working toward. Other questions, Anna? Do you see anything else?
That's all I've got in the chat, and I don't see any hands raised currently. So I think we're good to move to the next phase.
All right. So we will shift into sort of the education part of our agenda for today. So I know folks are probably coming to this with a variety of different levels of experience. Some of you engage in our process a lot and you know it quite well. Others of you might be sort of newer to this. So before we start talking about cluster or conservation development specifically, I actually want to start with setting the stage with some information about the land planning and development process and how some different kinds of regulations that you might hear about kind of work together. So for our purposes today, we're going to start with talking about the zoning code or the zoning regulations. And so every property in Davidson County has a zoning designation that's applied and approved by the Metro Council. Some properties have had the same zoning since the 70s. Some properties have had zoning that was updated kind of with a big countywide update in the 90s. And then certainly many properties have changed their zoning more recently. So it's also important to know that zoning is sort of what grants the entitlements or the allowances for any piece of property. It says how you can use the property and it sort of manages the physical conditions or the physical development. So it'll set out the allowed uses and the conditions on those. And then also things like building size or height or how many units. And for our purposes today, we're going to be talking mostly about subdivisions, creating new lots for one or two houses. So in our case, zoning would set out actually the minimum lot size, how many square feet you need in a lot, and how many units you can put in that lot. That comes from zoning. But if we were to look at this green square and pretend it's a piece of land somewhere in the county, and maybe it's 10,000 square feet. If we assume that the zoning on that piece of land is for single family residential, then the zoning code would say you can have one house on each lot. So that represents sort of them getting the one house that's permitted by that zoning. Now the next sort of piece of the puzzle are the subdivision regulations. And I think this is why whomever asked that question wanted to kind of clarify this up front. So these are a different set of regulations. They're actually under the purview of the Planning Commission rather than Metro Council, and that's because of state law. So Tennessee state law says the Planning Commission can adopt subdivision regulations and they make subdivision decisions. And the subdivision regulations set out the process and requirements for dividing a piece of land into multiple lots. But it doesn't control the number of lots permitted or the uses that are allowed on them. So in this case, if we had our same green piece of land and it was 10,000 square feet, let's say it's in a zoning district that has a minimum lot area or size of 5,000 square feet. It could be split in half, right? Each of those resulting lots would meet the 5,000 square foot or half of the original size. And now you have two lots. And that occurs under subdivision regulations. But often with development of property, those kind of steps are put together. So as the site is originally configured, you can only have one unit per lot, but it had enough area to be divided using the subdivision regulations into 2 lots. And now there's 1 unit on each of those lots. This was, there was no zoning that happened here. They just went through a subdivision in order to utilize the allowances that the zoning already permitted. The zoning permitted smaller lots and it permitted 1 unit on each. That's kind of how those 2 types of regulations can work together in terms of the subject that we're going to talk about today. So just kind of keep that in mind when you hear us say things like the subdivision occurs under the existing entitlements or the existing zoning. What we mean is that the zoning sets a minimum lot size, and if you don't make more lots than your zoning allows, that's all your kind of existing allowances. And that sometimes you go through both parts of this to get to the end sort of development result. So next I want to talk a little bit more specifically about what is cluster or conservation development. And so it's a planning approach that when you're doing a subdivision, creating new residential lots, it groups the lots or the properties in the subdivision closer together, often by reducing the lot size in order to utilize the rest of the land for open space or recreation, or in some cases, agriculture. It's a set of alternative zoning standards for things like lot size and open space and transitions that can be utilized when designing a residential subdivision. And these standards are already an option. They're already part of the zoning standards when you have a single family zoning district applied to the property or a 1 or 2 family zoning district. And you guys may know those as RS or R, but single family or 1 and 2 family. So there's no rezoning required to use these. They're just standards that are an option for someone who's doing a subdivision to create single family or 2 family lots. So what does that look like? So for purposes of today's discussion, when we say cluster or conservation development, we mean something that looks like this. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you see a subdivision for single-family homes that we would describe, or the regulations would describe, as conventional. So all of the land area is incorporated into the lots, the whole area of the site. And you've got the roads going back to serve all of those individual lots. Versus on the right-hand side, you have what might be described as a cluster or conservation subdivision development. And it's the same number of lots. It's just that they've been made smaller and grouped in kind of one portion of the site, leaving the remainder of the property as undeveloped open space. And you can see in this example, there's a stream and some trees, and so they've kind of tried to shift the lots away from those features. So that's what we mean when we say cluster. There are a lot of other ways that people use the term cluster development in the planning world. So sometimes when people say planning or say cluster, they're thinking about clustering development near our centers and corridors. This is a map from our Nashville Next general plan that a lot of you have probably seen before, called the Growth and Preservation Map, and it illustrates a community-wide goal to try to direct growth into our centers or along our major roadways. Some people call that clustering development. Sometimes when you hear the word cluster, for some people, they think of like a cottage development, or they might think of a horizontal property regime where you might put multiple units on a single piece of property. Some people, when they hear the term cluster, they might think apartment building or any sort of mixed use or dense development. Those are all ways that you can talk about clustering, or ways you could use that word, but they're not what we're talking about today. So the type of clustering that we're talking about today is very specific, and it's focused on creation of single family or two family lots that each would have one or two houses on them through a subdivision. So we wanted to make sure that was clear up front, just so folks know. These are all ways you could talk about clustering as well, but they're not necessarily related to this tool. And a lot of these would require rezoning or more intense zoning. This tool that we're going to discuss today is only for single or two family zoning districts. So I saw pop up in the chat sort of when a question about when cluster is approved, what happens to the green space. I think that's a good question. We'll talk about it a little bit more as we go. So just at a really high level, how does this work? So let's pretend we have a site that we're interested in, and this site is zoned for single or one or two family development. These are intended to be really cartoony, so don't read too much into the size of things or the numbers. It's just to help illustrate what we're talking about. So in order to even use this tool, you need to be zoned for single family or one or two family development, and you have to have a site that is 10 times the area that you need for a lot in that zoning district. What does that mean? Well, if your site is zoned for RS10, single family 10, you need a minimum lot size of 10,000 square feet. In order to use this tool, you'd have to have a site that's 100,000 square feet, 10 times the 10,000, or about 2.5 acres. So this is not a tool that comes into play like if someone just wants to get a second unit on their lot, or maybe, you know, with their neighbor. You got to have 10 times the size of your base zoning to qualify. It doesn't apply to agricultural zoning, and it doesn't apply to multifamily or mixed use zoning. So just to kind of make sure those are clear. So the middle image illustrates one way that you could design a conventional subdivision, but all of those lots would need to meet the minimum lot size of your zoning district, which in this example we've said is 10,000 square feet. So they're arranged on the site. They could take up the whole site. In this case, they leave a little bit of open space at the front, but that's not required. And there might be a number of different ways that someone could design a subdivision that has 10,000 square foot lots. But what's illustrated in the third image, the cluster, is again, you've got the same number as the conventional, but it has that open space set aside because those lots have been made smaller. Now, I've seen a few questions about what happens to the open space. So under the current standards, you create a plat, record a plat that designates that as open space, and it needs to be held as a common area for the development, which means a homeowners association or another sort of organization typically owns that and manages it. And that's how it's protected. By virtue of being on the plat as open space, there cannot be building permits issued in that area. But the way that different associations manage the open space in the development obviously varies by development. So there's no unified standard for how they manage that space. So this chart is a little overwhelming, but what it's here to show you is that in addition to the standard for how much property you need to qualify, there are also standards that govern how small you can make the lots, right? If you want to do this kind of development and have the lots smaller and grouped together, there's a limit to how much smaller you can make them. And it's 2 zoning districts smaller than the zoning that you have. So what you see on the left-hand side of this table is all of the single-family zoning districts that we have in Metro. And then on the right-hand side, you see all of the 1- and 2-family districts. But basically, as just an example, if we had a single-family 10,000 square foot zoning, you could make the lots potentially, some or all of them, as small as 5,000 square feet, but never smaller than that. So it's 2 districts. And then additionally, there are some other standards that say what happens if you are trying to have lots that are eligible for a duplex. You actually can't make those smaller than the base zoning requirement. And there are some standards about the size of lots that are on the perimeter or the edges of the development. Those have to be bigger, or they have to be separated from adjacent developments with landscaping. And those standards are intended to try to transition. And part of what we'll talk about today is what folks think about that. So in case you are more of a visual person, we've got a couple of examples. And these were just picked at random from things that the Planning Commission has approved. It's not intended to call out as good or bad or anybody's neighborhood. So if you happen to live here or near here, great. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to pick on anybody's house, but pictures help. So this is a site that's at the intersection of Hobson Pike and Pinhook Road. And this had that RS10, that single family, 10,000 square foot lot size base zoning. It's just about 24 acres. And if they had done just a regular subdivision, they could have had 88 lots here. And instead, they opted to set aside open space and do the clustered lot sizes. So the end result of this development was that it's 82 single family lots with new public streets. And then all of this green that you see colored in was open space. That's common area for this development, this neighborhood. It's about, I'm looking at my notes, it is about, well, 30% of the site, give or take. And you can see they're using it in different ways. So some of it has this hatching. Those are stormwater management areas. Some of it was envisioned kind of more as little pocket spaces for the residents. And a lot of it was just placed along the road here, I think, to kind of separate and visually screen the homes from the road. So that's one example, and that's kind of a larger site. We also sometimes see them on smaller sites and in areas that have a more consistent existing development pattern. So this is a site in the Donaldson area. And this site was just under 5 acres in size, and it actually has a single family zoning that requires a 20,000 square foot minimum lot size. So the lot size here is larger. They could have done 9 lots under their existing zoning, and they did propose 9 lots. They actually clustered down, but they didn't go as far, they didn't make them as small as was allowed. So they could have made the lots as small as 10,000 square feet, but most of them are kind of more like 15 or 16,000 square feet. So they didn't fully utilize all of the clustering potential here. And their open space, you can see, is all kind of largely at the front of the development. And they have a lot of stormwater kind of features in that area. So those are just a couple of examples in case that's helpful to you to see visually. So the next question, I see some questions that I'm gonna go through this, and then we'll take a quick pause and get to all of them. So the next question would sort of be, why do it? And I think there are reasons. All kind of communities across the country have standards for some form of this kind of development pattern, and they do it for different reasons. So some of the reasons that you might see include creating more open space, like for recreation or amenities for the residents of the neighborhood. In some cluster lot development type of standards, the purpose is to avoid kind of hazardous areas. So maybe a site has some steep slopes on it, or it has some soils that aren't stable. And this kind of tool would help avoid placing development in those areas. Another reason it's done commonly, and I think a reason that it's sometimes referred to as a conservation development, is that it can be used to offer greater protection to environmental features. So maybe things like streams or forested hillsides or, particular trees that are important. Another reason that it's sometimes allowed by various communities is actually, it has to do with infrastructure costs. So if you think back to that, the image we showed of a subdivision with the long streets and everything in lots versus the one on the right where the lots were clustered closer together, the roads that served those lots did not have to be as long. And that means usually that it's less expensive. Now that can be a cost saving for the developer, but to the extent that that Metro takes on the maintenance of those roads over time or the pipes, that's also less infrastructure to maintain for the community. And then another reason that communities sometimes use these is to provide for kind of different kinds of housing stock. Sometimes smaller lots will generate smaller units. Sometimes people don't want a big yard. In some communities, this is a tool that they use to encourage development and infill in particular areas where they want to see more of that activity. So I'm going to take a pause here and stop sharing, and I'm going to open up a question, which is to ask you guys what you think about cluster lot and what the purpose of it should be if we're going to have it in Nashville, or what you think the most important reason would be in Nashville to allow it. And while I get that open, we can start working through the questions that you guys have. And I'll stop sharing here so that you can all see each other. And bear with me just a second. Let me get the poll open for you.
Sean, while you're doing the poll, Sade with ITS has joined us. It seems that a number of folks don't have the chat to everyone option in their drop-down menu. And so Sade's looking into that. We may have to add a Q&A panel or another panel so that everyone can see each other. But just wanted to let you that some of you are able to chat with everyone and some of you aren't. And I apologize, we've never had this issue before, so we're trying to figure out how to navigate it. But feel free to message me if it's questions that I can then ask Sean to answer.
And Anna and everyone, I've also just turned on Q&A. So if you weren't able to, and I don't know if that will help, but if you weren't able to use the chat to everyone, you might see a question and answer panel, and you can try that. And if you don't see it, or if you feel like you have too many windows, in the bottom right, there'll be 3 little dots that look like an ellipsis, and you can click there. It'll say panel options, and you can reorganize or turn on or turn off the ones that you want to be able to look at. So we'll see if that helps also. So I think there were a number of good questions coming in the chat. Anna, were you able to sort of flag?
Yeah. Do you
Okay.
first want to address, we called it cluster law option in Nashville, and some folks haven't heard it referred to as conservation. So can you just kind of explain those two different terms?
Yeah, I think it's, so in Nashville, it's called the cluster lot option or cluster development. Conservation development is a term communities use to describe this kind of tool. And the idea being that part of the site is conserved for some purpose, versus ours sort of talks about it as the lots are clustered together. But the opposite of that is just that part of the site is conserved. I think for a lot of communities, this kind of development is viewed as a way to protect environmental features or sort of mitigate the impacts of development on sensitive environmental things. And so that conservation word is how they think about the purpose of this tool. But that's part of what we wanted to see what your thoughts were on on what you think the most important purpose is. Because I think what we'll talk about as we move into the next parts of our agenda today are sort of what the purpose is, and if that's our stated goal, do the standards help us get there? And you may feel that they do or they don't. You may feel that it should have a goal that that hasn't been identified before. But that's kind of the reason that we're using those terms interchangeably, even though our current one is called cluster, because we wanted to highlight that there's kind of a number of different things that this could achieve, and make sure folks were able to think about all of those options.
Great. Then a couple of questions on open space, which you may have responded to already, but when it's approved, is the green space reserved forever? And then does the responsibility and liability for the open space fall to an HOA or a similar organization?
Yeah, so it's as I think I said, it's recorded on a plat, and so that documents that there can't be additional sort of building in that area, and it does fall to its common space for the development. So it falls to an HOA to maintain that area. There are some communities that have a version of this tool where the open space goes into what's called a conservation easement. That would be held by a nonprofit or someone that's different than the owners of the land. And they have a very specific mission to monitor and protect that property over time. And there's nothing preventing someone from doing that in Nashville right now, but it's not how it's not what our regulations require. So right now, most of these are common space for a neighborhood that an HOA is responsible for.
Great. And then we have a couple of questions about the zoning factors that you were talking about. So if a property is zoned AR2A and they want to rezone using the cluster lot option, do they have to zone it in a way that would be 10 times what is needed?
So if it's zoned AR2A, they can't use this tool. This tool is not allowed on properties zoned AR2A. So if someone had a site with that zoning, but they wanted to do a cluster style development, they would first have to rezone the property. And that would be a different process, right? They would go before the Planning Commission to seek a zoning, either a single family zoning or a 2-family zoning, or they might propose what many of you have heard of as a specific plan zoning, where they actually just show the development for the site. But if zoned AR2A, this tool is not an option for them currently. So hopefully that clarifies that a little bit. Let's see, what else did we...
The first example you gave, the real world example, what was the RS10 requested to? RS5 or SP?
So let me see if I'm going to take another run at explaining that, because I think that the way I've said it was not clear to people. So it's just, let's talk about that example. So that site was zoned RS10, and the zoning there currently allows 10,000 square foot lots. The cluster lot option standards basically say your lots need to be 10,000 square feet under this zoning district, but you can choose under the cluster lot option to make them smaller if you do certain other things. And those are the other requirements of the tool. So in that case, they chose to meet all of the cluster requirements, and therefore were able to make those lots 5,000 square feet instead of 10,000. But they did not rezone, they did not change the zoning to do that. And maybe the best way I can think about to sort of help that make more sense is you might think about, in our zoning code, there are zoning districts that allow more than one use, right? So maybe you have a mixed use district and it allows, I'm just gonna pick 2 things, restaurants and a retail store. The requirements that you have to meet to have a restaurant are different than the requirements that you have to meet to have retail, but you can pick between those things without changing the zoning. And you can, as long as you meet the requirements, both of those things are allowed. Similarly, let's say you have a multifamily zoning. Multifamily zoning, you can choose to build an apartment building, but you can also choose to build just a regular single family home in multifamily zoning. And the minimum lot sizes that you need for those are different, right? So the zoning says if you're going to build a single family home in this zoning district, you need this size lot. If you want to build an apartment building, you need a bigger size lot. And if someone has property in that zoning, they can pick which one of those they want to follow, but they don't have to rezone to use it. And so it feels, I think, confusing because the lot sizes can be less, but that's already just an option in the zoning district. Does that help? Did I make it worse?
Someone spoke earlier that they opposed this option for their neighborhood. I'd like to hear why they opposed it. It sounds like a good idea, but I don't know who that was.
So
Oh,
I think
hey,
Robbie's got her hand up. If you'd like to go ahead, Robbie.
Sure. I can't communicate with all y'all for some reason, but I've been studying this for our neighborhood for over a year now. My email is rl@robbiehunsinger.com. I'll try to, and my phone number is 615-708-8034. Our experience has been that cluster development is the exact opposite of conservation development for our particular lots. I'm not saying that's always the case, but in our neighborhood, we have two beautiful lots coming off the Cumberland Bluff, and they wanted to put 32 homes on it, and they want to grade the crap out of the land and cut the trees. And there's no conservation aspect to the plan that I can tell. And it's been approved for one of the lots at this point. We found that it almost seemed there are more houses being proposed on the property than would fit in this particular lot because the lot's not square and it's got unusual topography. You could not put more than maybe 5 RS10 homes on the lot, but 8 homes have been approved to go on there because they're clusters, because they're smaller. And it almost seems like it can be abused, I feel like, in a way that allows denser development on a property that would not handle that development. I mean, you just couldn't fit 8 RS10 homes on the property that we're fighting for right now. And I know there are good uses of this ordinance that protect beautiful landscapes. You know, I don't know if it works better for larger lots, you know, but I mean, this is a 3-acre lot. It was first battle was a 9-acre parcel, and it would destroy everything on the property and include denser housing than would otherwise be possible. Sorry to have the opposing view here, but that's been my experience. I'm happy to talk with anybody. I'm sorry I can't. Maybe somebody else can post my phone number or something because I can't communicate with y'all. So thank you. I appreciate your presentation, Sean.
Yeah, no, so a couple things. I have so far, when I've emailed this group, I haven't emailed you in a way that you all have each other's contact information. And that was out of respect for folks. We invited more people than chose to participate. And sometimes people just don't want to be part of a public process, and we want to respect that. But if everyone in the group is comfortable, I can share your information, and then you can reach out to each other. So I'll send an email, but I'm getting a lot of thumbs up. So that wasn't because we didn't want you to talk to each other. It's because we wanted to respect anyone we invited who might not be interested. I also, I saw John Stern's hand go up, and I want to recognize him, but Valerie, you've asked a really great question, and I think this will probably lead us into the next phase of our discussion, where we talk a little bit about what we hear is or isn't working. But I don't want to cut off anybody who has questions specifically about the background information that we've just given. This will be probably a little bit of a fluid conversation where we'll have an issue and we'll do some more information and we'll keep going back and forth. So I saw John's hand next, and then I think I saw George's after that. So we'll go John and then George.
Yeah, Valerie, you're right. It sounds like a great way to save property, maintain natural areas. But when you get in practice, out in some of the areas where we're dealing with 40, 60, 80 acres, there are significant natural features that should be preserved without this option being considered. So it'd be nice to have Metro ensure that things like stormwater features, slopes, sinkholes, streams, cemeteries, all those kinds of areas be taken out of the calculation and be preserved in and of themselves before you go in and divvy up the property. Because if you take the entire 40 acres, and let's say 20 of it is really basically undevelopable, so they couldn't do it anyway, couldn't do anything they want, but they still could get the density from that 20 acres and put it on all on this other 20 acres when if we were actually managing our environmental features correctly, they wouldn't get it. Some developers even buy property that can't be developed and incorporate it into other property so they can get that bonus density. And so that's the challenge, Valerie. Sounds good, but we would love to see data over this last, what would it be, 30, 25, 30 years of the use of it. So good question, though.
Sure. All right, George, did you want to speak next? And then I see Robbie's hand after that.
Yeah, thank you. And I was going to go with something similar to what John was saying, in that the illustrations that we see, like that were the examples of what conservation or cluster lot developments can do that come from, like, say, APA books or manuals, they look fabulous. But when you compare them to what is then examples in practice, I feel like there's a drop off in result. And what John was talking about, in that max allowable lots calculated by a hypothetical bulk acreage of the subject parcel, provides a perverse incentive for developers to use a cluster lot option to then maximize the number of lots they can fit on the parcel. And depending on the percentages of requirements of required remaining open space, active or passive, or amenities, you basically end up with more density without a gain to the community. And then when you look at a parcel in a hypothetical sense, it doesn't help the community to understand what is already not buildable. And so therefore there's no gain to the community, and the developer gets increased density out of it without preserving any additional area for the community. And then the next consideration that's come to mind is that even when they do cluster these or increase the density using the cluster lot option, it's sometimes still manages to blanket the parcel or calculate pockets or strips of open space as opposed to meaningful bulk open space or setback envelopes, especially in areas of transition or adjacent to different densities. So I've run out of steam, but thanks for listening.
That's okay. Recharge. We're gonna keep moving forward. Robbie, did you have anything else, or was your hand a relic? Okay, I just wanted to check. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Shauna, are there some locations that you can tell us where it's worked successfully?
Well, I think it depends on your sort of definition of success, right? I mean, to some extent, we've had a number of these go through without opposition, and that, you know, could point to the fact that those communities found them to be compatible and great. It might also point to the fact that people don't know what the tool is or how it works, and we're conscious of that. I think, you know, we've had a number of them that do have opposition. A lot of the more recent examples are actually cases that I can't speak with you about in detail today because they're still being challenged or worked out. But a lot of the neighborhoods that that folks might see, this is also allowed through a tool that we call the Planned Unit Development, or PUD tool. And so you can utilize clustering. The standards are different, but there are standards in the PUD tool for clustering. And so in terms of sort of built examples, a couple that come to mind are actually in the sort of Bellevue or West Nashville area, where they were able to set aside a lot of land adjacent to the Harpeth River by using the clustering to make the lots smaller. And we can certainly bring some additional ones to the future meeting. I think what I'd like to, yep, go ahead, Tawana. I'm sorry, you were.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to echo what John and George and Robbie are saying, in that things that shouldn't be buildable anyway are also often what is not reported to planning. That's been my recent experience, is that they will know about features that should cause a particular area to not be suitable for building, and they do not report that. Their intent is just, often to blast through things. And so I echo what they say. I like the idea of clustering up things in order to save Metro money in maintenance in the long run. I like the idea as far as having some affordable housing, but there would have to be some way to prevent the misuse, and for them to have to actually report everything to you that the surveyor sees when they have feet on the ground, because the surveyors mark all these things, but then they don't get reported in the documents that y'all see, and that then get regurgitated back out to the community. And so people don't know about cemeteries and sinkholes and caves and so on and so forth. Thank you.
That makes sense. Kind of a data gap of sorts. Okay, I think all of that is super helpful. You guys are in many ways sort of on to the next part of the agenda, and I want to be respectful of your time. And we set this session to end at 1. And I also want to mention right now that we recognize that we're going to need to have multiple of these conversations. So I don't want anyone to feel like, because we're moving through our time here, that your opportunity to speak up is cut short. But I do want to kind of shift into the next part of our presentation, because I want to tell you a little bit about what we're hearing, which many of the things that we're hearing are echoing what you've just told us. And I also want to give you a particular scenario to kind of chew on as we go through and get, sort of move toward the next session. And so I do want to take a little time to show this to you before we have to wrap up today. So thank you all for the feedback so far. So, as I mentioned, we want to identify some things that we've heard, but also give you a chance to chime in on this as well. And so this will be kind of a preview, and then you can think on it. And then as we come to our next session, there may be things you want to add to this list. We have heard on some cases sort of notable opposition or concern that falls into kind of 3 different categories. And I think actually some of the comments we've had so far have highlighted these 3 exactly. So the first kind of categories of concerns that we hear about this tool has to do with the open space and the environmental protection. We get a lot of comment that it's kind of the leftovers of the site, or the areas that weren't buildable anyway, that it's not super great quality. Maybe too much of it is in stormwater and not enough of it is usable. Or that it's not configured well. It's sort of in these little pockets or along the edges. So we hear comments to that effect. We also hear, kind of on the flip side, and depending on the setting, a lot of comment and concern about how the resulting development doesn't fit with the neighborhood. So this is things like the lots are too small, the homes are different, the setbacks aren't right, but something about the development doesn't feel consistent to people who already live in the area, right? That the smaller lots, the clustering is creating something that's kind of foreign. And then last, I think there's this question of, and this is what George's comments were sort of alluding to, is that there's different ways to understand what the zoning currently permits. There's sort of a hypothetical or a mathematical way to to calculate that. And then there's sort of what does that mean on the ground. And so we're going to come back to all three of these in a lot more detail. But I just wanted to lay out that those are some of the concerns that we're hearing. And I think what we're sort of identifying, the kind of underlying tension in all these concerns, is that ultimately this tool it's kind of in a balancing act. So the cluster lot option as it exists in our zoning code right now is trying to balance the existing zoning that's already in place on a site. It's trying, whether it's succeeding or not, I don't know, but it's trying to encourage some environmental protection or some creation of common open space. And it's also trying to ensure that there are good transitions that help that development, that cluster development, fit into existing neighborhood character. And I think what we're seeing, what we're taking away from the comments, is that in certain settings, or maybe it's on smaller sites, sometimes it's not balancing all those things very well. You know, they may conflict with each other, or they can't all be achieved at once. And so when that happens, we get comments that take issue with the tool. And I think in particular, it can be hard because we often have zoning in Nashville that's the existing development, right, it's not actually as intense as the zoning would permit. I mean, most of our single family zoning in Nashville permits houses that are 3 stories tall, but you don't often see, a lot of neighborhoods don't have a lot of 3-story tall houses. So, but I think when we think about this sort of balancing act to make it a little bit more visual, historically, we had sort of lot patterns or land planning that looked a bit like this, right? So the zoning was applied without regard for what was on the site, and the lots would be created or platted without much regard for that either. And so you might have features in lots, or, just pretend this hatching is like trees or a hillside or whatever, you want to think of it as. And maybe it's in the back of the lots. It's also possible that with development of these sites, it was destroyed or lost. And so that's sort of a historical or conventional way to approach subdivision. And I think, in more current times, more contemporary planning and land development practice, ideally, we would take this approach, which is where you do try to really protect those environmental features and design the site in a way that's sensitive to the landscape. Although to Tawana's point, that requires knowing what's there first and being honest about it. But I think that, this tool could, as many of you have identified, help us maybe in some locations to get a better development pattern that's more sensitive to the environment, that has less infrastructure. But to do that, it's got to be kind of calibrated correctly. And part of this exercise is trying to figure out if there are parts of it that aren't. But in particular, I think what we see happen, just ignore for a minute that the streams start and stop all over the place. That's a function of my cartoons. Pretend there's springs. This neighborhood has a lot of springs. I think in particular what can get tricky, right, is when we have an existing area that has kind of those more traditional larger lot patterns, and someone comes in and utilizes the cluster option on the same street or in the middle. This middle image, it looks and feels foreign to people, right? It's not a development language that they're used to seeing in their neighborhood. So it's a little bit of a tension, right? It might be better site design in terms of if we all care about this river and the trees that are around it, but the trade-off is that the development can't look the same, or the lots can't look the same as what we're used to seeing. And so it's all about that balance. And I think certainly we've heard from you so far, and we're going to keep hearing, I think, that in cases the balance is off. But as we kind of have some last time for discussion today, and as we move into the future sessions, I would really encourage you guys to think about that. How do we make sure we're calibrating it so that it does get us better protection or better public space, if that's what we want, but also get comfortable with the differences in the development patterns. And so I'll stop sharing because I see a lot of hands.
Please put that back up. Please put that slide back up. To me, that last slide right there kind of illustrates the crux of the problem. In the first display showing just the 3 homes, they obviously were entitled to 3 homes. And in applying the cluster lot, you increased it to 8. So the developer has less upfront costs. The houses, more likely than not in today's world, cost the same, but you're nearly tripling the density for that neighborhood. So I guess where I get lost is if we're going to allow them to reduce cost by having smaller lot sizes, less roadway, less utility, et cetera, why are we also giving them 3 times as many? Why don't we preserve more of that as green space, and maybe we only double it to 6, and then everybody still wins?
So let me clarify that quickly. This is an error of my illustration here, right? You can compare this 3-lot one to this 3-lot one, and you can compare this 8-lot one to this 8-lot one, but you would not be able, if you had only a right to 3, you couldn't get to 8 using this tool.
But this is really what we're seeing. I'm so sorry, but this is exactly what we're seeing that I'm having a lot of people in my community are having a problem with. This is an illustration of exactly what is going on, that they're using it to bump up density when they could not do that if they put a normal subdivision in. I'm so sorry to jump in. I'm out. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I think, I can get into that or sort of try to walk you through the logistics, but and we will do that as we move through, because I think understanding the yield is important, right? To George's point, if you don't know what is possible under the existing zoning, it's hard to know if what you're getting is better. But the way that you calculate the maximum number of lots in a cluster lot option, you actually already have to subtract some of your site. It may not be enough, or it may not be the right parts of your site, but if what we're talking about is sort of how many lots can you achieve mathematically using the zoning, they can't get more because the cluster lot option requires them to reduce that. And I think that that's probably something that's worth showing before we wrap up today, because I think maybe that will help folks. I also understand Robbie's point about how they are getting more than you would be possible if they all had to be the right size, but it's not more than the zoning allows. And I think that's the kind of linchpin there. Let me show some other images while we're talking here to try to help clarify that a little bit. But are there other questions? Yeah.
It seems, I understand that there is an equation that states how many lots somebody can put on a parcel, right? And that's the same number whether it's a regular subdivision or a cluster lot. But what they're not doing is, like, if you have a parcel that happens to be really narrow and goes back, it's just a very long rectangle, they're not considering that it's impossible to fit more than X number of homes on that parcel with a regular subdivision. What they're doing is pulling back and doing the math equation and saying, well, they say we can put this many homes, even though they could not physically do it. And plus they got to put a 45-foot road in there. I feel like there's a disconnect, and developers are using that to basically change zoning without going through a hearing. And it's a problem.
Yeah, I hear you. I want to show these graphics because I want to make sure that others who aren't as familiar with the tool are able to understand what you're talking about, because I think it gets a little I follow you exactly. And I think to your point, that indicates some changes that we might need to make to the standards in the tool. But let me walk through this. And for those of you who've done this before, this is not going to be new, but I want everyone to be able to see what we're talking about so that we're not just throwing around words that aren't connected to things. So if we go back to this site, there's sort of the idea that your zoning sets out a minimum lot size. And one way to think about how many lots you're allowed, how many units you're entitled to, is just to do a mathematical equation. And you take the acreage of your site and you divide it by the minimum lot size and you come up with a number. And in this hypothetical example, I came up with 10. But I think we all look at that and we know that you can't really do that. Because on a really basic level, the person who lives in house number 4, it can't get to their house. But there may be a number of other factors on that site that are controlling how you can reasonably build it as well. There may be a floodplain that you can't put a house in. So that's just a number, right? It's the mathematical number. That's the most you could ever achieve under the zoning. The question, I think, that gets tricky is, okay, so what does a conventional subdivision look like? You can never get more than math, right? But there could be a number of different approaches depending on the specifics of the site and the goals of the developer to how that conventional subdivision is designed. So maybe they want really big lots with mansions on them and they're going to sell those for some price, and they choose not to utilize the full zoning potential, right? Maybe they want to max it out, but they don't want to build any infrastructure. I'm not going to tell you that these are allowed, right? These are just cartoons of things that someone could come up with. Maybe there's a floodplain at the front between the street and those lots, and they're avoiding that, and so they're only going to put 8, but they are going to put a new road. I think that sort of makes it hard universally to say how many you might get, because on each site, how close you can get to this mathematical max is going to be different, right? If there's a floodplain, you may not be able to put stuff there. You can put some lots in floodplain, some parts of lots, as long as the building envelopes are right. But there may be other factors that are sort of driving whether you can get there or not. I think what's really hard is that to the extent that engineers or land planners are going through some exercise like this, we don't see it. You guys don't see it. We don't know what they've considered or not. We may look at the site and think how we would design it or what we think fits. But I'm willing to bet on a lot of sites, if you gave 3 different engineers or surveyors the property, they might come up with 3 different layouts that could meet the standards. So it's not that, it's always going to be less than this, but until someone proposes it, we don't really know. And I think when George asked his question, that's difficult. You don't know what you're comparing to. Now, what I will say is that the cluster lot, it has a different mathematical calculation. So when you figure out, if you want to do a cluster lot proposal, when you're trying to figure out how many lots you can fit, it actually forces you to subtract 15% of the site before you do this math. And that's, I think what we'll probably get into in our next session is that the right number? Is that the right way to go about it? But it does actually already limit you more. So if I were this site and I want to do cluster, I actually can't get back to 10 because I got to reduce my acreage first. And then you have your cluster. Now, I think the question that comes up is, of all these sort of myriad conventional layouts, and I think this is what Robbie is identifying here, this maximum number under cluster, if you can make them smaller, you might be able to fit them better around the sensitive features, right? It may be that if you couldn't put in the floodplain, one of these would actually, you may not really be able to get to 7. and making the lot smaller does make it possible to get to 7. But that's actually the assumption behind this tool. The idea is that this open space, this kind of layout, is more valuable, it's a better development pattern, even if it allows someone to more fully utilize their zoning entitlements, right? What this tool would suggest, now I'm not telling you that we think it's working perfectly right now, that's why we want your feedback, but the idea is that we as a community think that even if we get more lots, we like this type of development, we like what it does for our overall public good better than any of these other options that we might get. So I don't say that to say that they're not getting more than this ever, right? So when we say they're not increasing the density beyond the zoning, that's what we mean. They're not increasing it beyond the math, but they are achieving it differently. They're able to utilize it differently. And that's actually the intent, right? The idea is that there's a trade-off there that we feel like is worth it. And to the extent that what you're seeing in your neighborhood is not appealing, or you don't, then that's an indication that the trade-offs are not correctly balanced, right? The value of the open space we're getting is not worth those additional smaller lots. And that's very much the reason that we want to have these conversations. So I think hopefully kind of seeing those images is useful to people. So I don't want to cut anyone off, but I also don't want to keep people too long. We just kind of threw a lot of information at you. There's a lot of questions I'm sure that we have not gotten to. But we can try to get through a few more, or we can, either way, we're going to send you this presentation and we're going to send you a link to this recording so that you can hear the discussion. But I wanted to show those because I think where we'd like to go next time is less of you hearing me talk and more me hearing you talk now that you've had a chance to kind of get some information and some background. So with that, I'll stop talking. I see a lot of hands, but I don't know what order they came up. What other questions can we kind of handle today? And thank you, all of you, for being here. I'll reach out with more info if you are having to drop off. But what else can we speak to before we wrap?
Sean, I'll help you with the hands raised. I put in the chat. Okay. If you have to drop off, because as we said, 1 o'clock was our cutoff, please do. We really appreciate your time today, and we'll follow up. We'll also have a record of the chat and the Q&A. So if you've put questions in there and we haven't got to them, we will try to follow up after we've saved the file. So if anyone wants to hang around, we'll hang around and answer questions. But really appreciate everyone's time. And I think maybe George was first, and then Jessica, and then Gordon, and then we'll be wrapping up.
Sorry for my awkward ritual of unmiking there or unmuting there. Thank you all. I really appreciate it. And I want to take up too much time to close out on the first questions I have after that presentation. I think going back to my issue of net buildable area and Sean's fantastic illustration, that bottom right result that was in your drawing of the clustered lots preserving the quarter, what we see in my neighborhood is that area that's preserved would have been preserved anyway because it's not buildable. So that you end up with a result of a builder gaining additional density without any additional benefit to the community, without adequate screening or meshing of that into the area. And it's by entitlement, it's anyway. And then I guess, so changing the calculations of the particulars of a lot for a cluster lot become really critical in areas where you may have a lot of primary conservation area that should have been preserved anyway, and that there's no reason that developer should get the additional density by preserving areas that were already not buildable. All right, well, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Jessica, did you want to go? And then Gordon?
I do. Thanks for the opportunity. I've learned a lot today. And I've actually been involved in this one specific zoning thing that's in my backyard for 2 years now. And it's been quite a roller coaster, from everything of getting served a cease and desist and bullied over the first action, to now being currently back in front of the Planning Commission. So it's been a real fun, interesting roller coaster. But a lot of what I'm seeing as far as my questions, as far as just a member of the community, is this balancing act that's being presented to us as far as this conservation is really conflicting to me. The whole point that we need to even address this is that it's a population issue with Nashville. We have had an influx of people where our infrastructure is not really ready for it, and the zoning that's been issued was issued for a future foresight by whoever put those in place for that. So when we go to the example of the 3 homes, and then there was the 8 homes in the cluster lot option, we talk about how that's going to conserve green space. But what I have never heard addressed, as far as each of us has an environmental impact. Every breath we take is carbon monoxide, our cars, our exhaust. So yes, now you've maybe saved 0.25 acres of land, but now you've had 3 homes that are now 8 homes. So that's, how many more times of people living in that same area. So what's the environmental impact of saving that amount of land versus putting that much population? So those are a lot of questions that come and get raised for me as far as a neighbor and a person in our community. That just doesn't make sense. When we look at this balancing act, the balancing act is incorporating all the people that want to live in Nashville and all the people who want to build. And that's really the main priority. And that we're all adjusting for those people's needs and wants, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think it's great comments. I do. So one of the things that's happening with this tool is that it's utilized with zoning that's already there. And so I think one of the things we struggle with all across Nashville is that we put zoning in place in the 70s often that allowed for a lot more lots, a lot more units than has been built so far. We zoned areas of our county that we all think of as pretty rural for like 1/4 acre lots, right? Which are, they're not nothing, but those are relatively small in the scope of Jolton or Whites Creek or some parts of our, southeastern part of our county. And so what I think is happening, at least in part with this tool, is that it's being utilized by that zoning that's been there. And I think we want to talk more about that with you next time, because I think that's a little bit of the push and pull as well. But thank you for being here and for your thoughts, for sure.
All right, let's go to Gordon, and then I think Tawana's raised her hand, and then we probably need to wrap up.
I hope I don't use up more time than what we could allow for Tawana, because she always makes good points. But so my first question is there a way to determine when the cluster lot option has been engaged in a rezoning? And I'm assuming that a cluster lot option comes along with a rezoning, or is a cluster lot option an alternate way to develop the property with your current entitlements and the current zoning?
It is the second thing. It is an alternate way to develop in conjunction with your current zoning. So the form that it comes to the Planning Commission is as a subdivision proposal, usually a concept plan for a subdivision. It would not come to the Planning Commission in conjunction with a rezoning. Now, there may be rezonings, right, that are intended to then allow them to access this tool, or maybe there are specific plans that are based on this principle. There may be zoning that is borrowing this idea, but this will always come to the Planning Commission as a concept plan for a subdivision, because it's using the zoning. It's a set of rules for the zoning that's already there.
So Because that was one of the concerns that I have heard repeated by several people is increased density. And part of looking at, and pursuant to some of our previous discussions, looking at you can only build X number of lots, within a particular property under current entitlements. What it seems like it's doing is it's creating smaller lots packed closer together to give a perception of increased density when there's not really any additional density going in unless they are doing a rezoning. So this is where I find challenges with different developers and people at different levels of experience with planning process. A lot of times some of these terms are misused or they're thrown around loosely without a real understanding what the term means. Or I mean, I've heard developers use terms that were completely inapplicable to a situation, and it's because they truly didn't understand what was going on. And that's why I guess I want to make sure that this tool in and of itself does not increase. If anything, it slightly reduces density, even though the perceived concentration of structures make it look more dense. But in and by it of itself can't increase density beyond current entitlements. And I just want to make sure that I clearly understand that.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think that's why we wanted at the beginning to mention a number of ways that people talk about cluster development or use that term that aren't this, right? Someone may very well show a plan to a community and say, this is a specific plan zoning for cluster homes, right? And that may be how they want to talk about it, but that is not this tool. That is a rezoning to a specific plan zoning district for something that they're describing as clustered lots.
Right, and that's where some of the confusion comes in.
Yeah, that's where it comes in. And so that's, I think, a big part of this is really trying to do a little bit of education so that folks know what it is we're going to be able to affect if we make changes to this tool. If we adjust these standards, and we get them, we change them and they work the way that people want, it's still not going to prevent someone from proposing a rezoning, right? There may still be proposals in your neighborhood for more density, and that could be an option. But this would be standards that affect people developing under zoning that's already in place. So I think, thank you for asking that. Yeah.
Sure. So is there a way when there is an entry in the development tracker for subdivision, is there a way to notate or classify it as this subdivision is being proposed under the cluster lot option so that becomes, I don't want to say immediately visible, but it's notated that is the option being utilized and these are the standards that are going to go with it as opposed to the standard subdivision regs?
Right. I think that's a really good suggestion. I'll be honest with you that, this tool has existed at least since the 90s. And there's not been consistency. That's been a challenge for me trying to research how the past ones have worked, right?
When have we heard this before?
Right. There's not consistency in how they've been tracked. When we do them now, we write that into the caption, the description, right? So it'll say X number of clustered lots. But again, if you're just an average person trying to go about your life, that's not necessarily obvious to you. You may not know to look there. So I think that's a really good suggestion for a different way to name them so that it's easier for people to find out that they're what they are and comment if they want to.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. I don't want to cut anyone off, but I do have another engagement after this. So would it be possible to hear from Tawana? And then we're going to have a lot more time.
I'm done.
The rest of feedback. Thank you, Gordon.
I'll be quick. I have 3 quick points to make. One is that I feel like we are putting sort of the cart before the horse. If you allow the more intense zoning for the purpose of then getting cluster lots, but it is not linked to the cluster lot option and they're not forced to get that, it will allow them to only do the zoning part of it and never come back with the cluster lot development portion. So I think if they're going to rezone for the purpose of going for cluster, that it should be conditional. They should only be able to do it conditional upon completing the cluster lot option. Number two, I want to make sure that you as planning employees understand what the developers say to us, and we hear this from many different developers. It's not specific to one. They will show us a very pretty map and say, look at all this green space we're reserving. And then they get offended when we say, it's in the creek, you weren't going to be able to build there anyway, or it's, whatever the feature may be. So they're not generally going to give up anything unless they're forced to give up something extra. And that kind of leads to my third point is I would like to know, do you as Metro Planning employees really know what's on a property? Do you know with certainty that certain areas of our county hold water all the time? Do you know where the caves are? Do you know where the sinkholes are? Because what I've been experiencing is these things show up on the maps that were done, the topo maps from the 10s and the 20s and the 30s. But when you start moving through the decades, they don't show up on the maps from the last 2 or 3 decades. And so I wonder if the planner, the developer rather, is able to come to you and show you something that doesn't even capture all the things that the community knows are out there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think the data question is a good one, and it's a comment we've heard in some other meetings as well. So we will send this presentation to everyone. The recording takes a couple of days to come through, and then we'll have to get it posted somewhere you guys can access it because it's too big to email, but we'll get that out as well. And then we'll also reach out to you once we've had a chance to digest a little bit with kind of a focus and some possible times for a next session so that we can get more of your feedback once you've had a chance to digest. And we'll try to find a time that works for the majority. So I want to thank everyone so much for being here today. I want to thank you for your questions and for having thought about this issue. It's really beneficial for us to have this as we get started sort of evaluating this tool. And we will we'll get in touch with you by email about next steps. So thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. It's good to see you all.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Anna. Bye, guys.
Thank you all.